It was very easy to make oneself beloved and respected aboard a ship. One had only always be ready to obey one's superior officers and to be kind to the common men, unless there was occasion for severity, and if you are, when there is just occasion, they will not like you any worse for it. Fletcher Christian, acting lieutenant and lead mutineer of HMAV Bounty. In the annals of maritime history, there are many tales which exemplify the tenacious and indomitable human spirit. One story in particular is held in the highest of regards by sailors and explorers alike. Most interestingly, this story features a man who is almost certainly the architect of his own downfall. Despite being highly skilled, his actions would set events in motion that would eventually involve fleeing from murderous islanders, eating raw seagull, and a 4,000-mile transnavigation of the vast Pacific Ocean back to civilization. This is of course the story of Captain William Bligh and the mutiny of HMAV Bounty, a strong reminder that qualities like stellar navigation and seamanship are not all that creates a competent officer. William Bligh was born on the 9th of September 1754 in the county of Devon, southwest England. In a terrifyingly commonplace occurrence for his time, he was integrated into George III's Royal Navy as a young gentleman at the age of 7. This station was specifically for boys of his higher class to ensure they gained the necessary experience and competence for when they were later commissioned as an officer. Bligh would swiftly rise through the ranks and in 1776 would be given the position of sailing master of the HMS Resolution by the famous, or infamous depending who you're talking to, Captain James Cook. Whilst under his command, Bligh received praise for his ability by the renowned British explorer. The third voyage into the Pacific Ocean would be Cook's last, as he was beaten to death on one of the many picturesque beaches on the Big Island of Hawaii by the indigenous population as he attempted to abduct their king. Bligh was then given even more responsibility as navigator of the expedition by the newly appointed commander, Captain Charles Clerke. They then spent time in the North Pacific coast, attempting to find the fabled Northwest Passage. Upon their failure to find such a route and the death of Captain Clerke from tuberculosis, Bligh was instrumental in the expedition's ability to navigate their way back to Britain, an accomplishment he felt he was underappreciated for. Upon returning to the UK, Bligh's career would further flourish. He gained a commission to lieutenant after his actions at the Battle of Dogger Bank under Admiral Parker, and later fought with Lord Howe at the Battle of Gibraltar in 1782. This is where the threads of fate intertwined and he would meet Fletcher Christian, a ship's boy at the time. Fletcher was considered old for his rank, being 17 as opposed to the usual 12 to 15, and a decade older than Bligh when he had joined. Perhaps his age benefited him, as he swiftly rose through the lower ranks, and later, whilst on a voyage to India, was promoted to acting lieutenant. With the Royal Navy being largely demobilised at the end of the American War of Independence, Bligh and Christian were discharged and joined the Merchant Navy, and eventually the vessel Britannia together. Bligh had finally reached the rank of captain aboard Britannia, and when his acquaintance and tangential family friend applied for a berth on his ship, Bligh happily obliged. Christian had to take a significant demotion upon joining, from acting lieutenant to able seaman. Despite this, Bligh treated Christian as one would an officer, allowing him an officer's berth and access to their dining quarters. In their time aboard Britannia, despite many ranks and a decade's difference of age between the two, a friendship blossomed between the young men, with Bligh teaching Christian how to navigate the ocean. On the second voyage of theirs with Britannic, Christian was promoted to second mate, a rank more fitting his skill and competence. On the 16th of August 1787, Bligh took command of His Majesty's armed vessel Bounty. Despite it having some qualifiers to be called a ship, namely 3 masts and a full set of rigging, it was only 90 foot long and so was referred to as a cutter. This meant Bligh would be demoted to commanding lieutenant, being the only commissioned officer on board. Arguably even more importantly, the usual contingent of Royal Marines, those employed for the ship's protection, as well as maintaining order on the vessel, were not allocated. Bligh had wished for his friend Christian to serve as the Bounty's sailing master, but the Naval Board denied this request, stating he lacked experience. Instead, a man by the name of John Fryer was to serve directly under Bligh, with Christian as Fryer's master's mate. The mission of the Bounty was at first to sail around Cape Horn, the very bottom of South America, to cartograph the important and underexplored passage. They would then sail to Tahiti, filling their stores with breadfruit, a staple food of the tropics, then make their way to the West Indies Islands through the Indian and South Atlantic Oceans. Tahiti was selected as the island to procure the breadfruit from, not because it was the only location the fruit grew, but because additional British vessels, as well as developing a trade route, would aid the United Kingdom in its territorial contention of the area with France. This expedition was particularly financially viable, as the Royal Society had offered a premium or reward to anyone who could transport living specimens of the fruit to the British colonial plantations in the West Indies Islands. The hope in this endeavour would be to provide a cheap and suitable food crop for the enslaved population to subsist on. Because of this, the breadfruit would have to be kept alive during this passage, and so 2 civilian botanists, or gardeners, were included in the crew. On the 28th of November 1787, the Bounty set sail from Spithead, near Portsmouth, South England, with a crew of 46 men. Immediately they were delayed as opposing wind meant they were stuck in the estuary until they finally made way on the 23rd of December. Bligh was already anxious about delays. Their arrival at Spithead had already been pushed back by incompatible weather, and the Admiralty then took time delivering the final sailing orders. Each day lost meant a higher likelihood of adverse weather and an additional difficulty of traversing Cape Horn as winter set in. Once sailing, Bligh enacted the strict discipline regarding sanitation and diet he had learnt during his time with Cook. According to historian Sam McKinney, Bligh enforced these rules with a fanatical zeal, continually fussing and fuming over the cleanliness of his ship and the food served to the crew. He introduced a watch contrary to that practised of the Royal Navy, which meant that for every 4 hours of time on watch, the crew would receive 8 hours of rest. Bligh considered spirits were high aboard Bounty, as he wrote in his dispatches, "Both men and officers tractable and well disposed, and cheerfulness and content in the countenance of everyone." At this time, no infractions were met with punishment, and for the crew's exercise and entertainment, Bligh introduced regular music and dancing sessions. Although Bligh perceived this as a positive, as exercise would strive off boredom and depression on board, the crew on the other hand found the 4-hour-long dancing sessions gruelling and Bligh's fastidious cleanliness impossible to accomplish. One early point of contention was Bligh's professional relationship with Fletcher Christian. Despite Christian officially being the master's mate, as ordered by the Admiralty, Bligh instead treated him as his second-in-command, circumventing sailing master John Fryer. Bligh made this hierarchy official even before reaching Cape Horn, as on the 2nd of March he declared Christian acting lieutenant, officially outranking Fryer. Although Christian had already held this position on HMS Yndis, this order directly countermanded what had been put forth by the Admiralty. A week after this incident, Matthew Quintal was the first to receive corporal punishment aboard Bounty, with 12 lashes for insolence and mutinous behaviour. This was the first of many disciplinary acts to come during this expedition. They eventually made their way across the Atlantic to Cape Horn, arriving on the 2nd of April 1788, but spent a month there battling stormy seas and contrary winds, which exceeded what I had ever met with before, with severe squalls of hail and sleet, wrote Bligh. He finally accepted defeat on the 17th of April and decided to head around the Cape of Good Hope, a route which would be 7,000 miles longer to get to Tahiti. This perceived failure must have weighed on Bligh. Despite him being generally content with his crew's demeanour and health, this was the first time he had true command of a Royal Navy vessel, and so he wished to perform to an outstanding standard. Any failures to carry out orders from the Admiralty, despite however impossible they were, would forever be a black mark against his name, possibly impacting his likelihood of further promotion. On the 24th of May 1788, the Bounty anchored off the Cape of Good Hope to refit and reprovision for 5 weeks. During this break from seafaring, it was said that Christian asked Bligh to lend him some money. Historian Greg Denning says this may have been the first instance of their relationship diminishing, as it would have created a possible feeling of anxiety and therefore resentment towards Christian. On the 1st of July 1788, they left the Cape of Good Hope en route to their next port of call, Adventure Bay, on Tasmania. As they approached the island, the weather was blustery and wet, similar to when they had attempted to pass Cape Horn, but Bligh, with his excellent navigational skills, sighted Mewstone Rock on the 19th of August. They made land in Tasmania on the 21st of August 1788 and began the task of recuperating once again, whilst engaging peacefully with the native population. They fished, collected water in casks for the voyage, and harvested wood for repairs on the vessel. This was where Bligh's singular-sighted vision cropped up once again. By records, he was unhappy with the technique the carpenter, William Purcell, used to cut wood, and after ordering him back to the ship, an order which Purcell refused, Bligh threatened to withhold his rations, which immediately brought him to his senses, wrote Bligh. After leaving Tasmania, on the way to Tahiti, there was a further point of contention, this time with Fryer and Bligh. Bligh needed the vessel's account books countersigned, but Fryer refused to, until Bligh provided him with a certificate stating of Fryer's complete competence throughout the voyage. Despite being roughly 7 months into the voyage, they had yet to complete their initial task of collecting the breadfruit crop, and so Bligh refused. He then summoned the crew and read aloud the Articles of War, the regulations that a Royal Navy vessel must abide by. After this show of authority, Fryer finally backed down. Shortly after this, the first death occurred on board. Able seaman James Valentine had died from a blood infection caused when the vessel's alcoholic surgeon, Huggan, haphazardly let Valentine's blood in an attempt to cure his asthma. Huggan reported to Bligh that Valentine died of scurvy, a condition that results from a vitamin C deficiency, and so Bligh administered his own medicinal remedies to the ship's crew, whilst also confiscating Huggan's alcohol. The Bounty finally made anchor at Tahiti on the 26th of October 1788, a journey of 27,000 nautical miles from their start roughly 11 months ago. Their arrival on the island was met with cooperation and jubilation, as the local chiefs, as well as the King of Tahiti, Pomarere I, knew Bligh from the time he had spent on the island under the command of Cook. Bligh lavished the King of Tahiti with gifts, stating that his own king, George III, only wished for breadfruit in return, a trade that Pomarere gladly accepted. Frustratingly for Bligh, the breadfruit, by advice from the onboard botanists, was far from ready for transportation. The plants would have to mature for at least 5 months before they could be potted and stored aboard the ship to be taken to the West Indies. With this news, Bligh ordered Christian to lead a shore party to build a compound on Tahiti where the fruit could be cultivated. Frustratingly for the crew, Bligh commanded that any trade with the islanders happened through him. Though this seemed overtly authoritarian, in fact, it was to ensure the economy of the island did not crumble under the sudden surge of additional demand. During the months-long wait, discipline slipped as debauchery and frivolity blossomed. The men soon integrated with the indigenous Tahitians, more specifically, the women. Having been cleared of any venereal diseases before arrival on the island, 18 of the crew were soon treated for such an infection. Many of them began relationships. Including Christian, he renamed his partner Maratua to Elizabeth, a previous love from back home. Many of the men were tattooed in the Tahitian fashion, a physical manifestation of their indoctrination into the culture. Bligh himself did not engage in such activities, but could empathise with his men's persuasions, writing, "The allurements of dissipation are beyond anything that could be conceived." He did not, though, feel that this was adequate excuse for dereliction of duties. Equipment was left out, which the Tahitians swiftly stole, and which the men and Christian were blamed for. After all, Bligh had elevated his friend to a position he could only dream of, and in return, Christian, who was now the second in command, served as a poor role model for the rest of the crew by allowing order and discipline to diminish and engaging in relationships with the indigenous. Bligh's feelings on this matter are confirmed in writing, where he states, "Such neglectful and worthless petty officers, I believe, were never in a ship as there are in this." Because of this perceived betrayal, or genuine failure to carry out conduct befitting of an officer, Christian bore the brunt of Bligh's punishment, being constantly belittled in front of the crew and the indigenous population. Over this time, in an attempt by Bligh to regain control over his crew, corporal punishment became more and more common. Instances like this are apparently where Bligh's leadership skills became questionable. There are many accounts of his tyrannical authoritarianism, a trait he most likely picked up from Cook. Bligh, though, had failed to contemplate the vast difference between his voyage and the ones he took under Cook. Cook was a celebrity among his men, and as well had many officers and marines to ensure the rigid command structure of the Royal Navy, whilst Bligh was the only commissioned officer on board Bounty. Cook was able to implement the rigorous cleanliness and health routines because any punishment for infractions would be administered by, and therefore the agitation aimed towards, lower officers. Bligh was judge, jury and executioner aboard Bounty, and so all the resentment was piled at him. Bligh would jump into fanatical berating, belittling and shaming Christian and others in front of the crew and Tahitians alike. It was said that once he finished his tirade, he would then attempt to curry favour, acting overtly friendly to those he had just been reprimanding minutes before. Not only did this completely invalidate the chastising he had just delivered, it made him seem uncontrolled, remorseful and weak-willed, qualities that are incompatible with competent leadership. On the 5th of January 1789, 3 of the crew, William Muspratt, John Millwall and Charles Churchill, ironically the Bounty's master-at-arms, the closest enforcer of discipline aboard the vessel, deserted on a small boat carrying guns and ammunition. Of the possessions Churchill left behind was a cryptic list of names, including Christians, which Bligh convinced himself was a list of the men who aided the three's desertion. After 3 weeks, the deserters were located, hauled back to the ship and flogged as punishment. Over February, the crop of over 1,000 breadfruits were brought aboard and preparation began to once again set sail. Bligh felt he was truly on the last leg of his mission and was impatient to begin sailing to the West Indies. His men, on the other hand, could not be less interested in spending the next few months with a tyrannical, authoritarian leader. They had enjoyed a life of indulgence and serenity on Tahiti, and from their perspective Bligh had changed from someone who had ensured they were well fed, rested and entertained, to a paranoid sadist. On the 5th of April, the Bounty finally left Tahiti, bound for the West Indies. And on the 22nd of April, the Bounty anchored off the island of Tonga to collect water, wood, and other supplies before making their way through the Endeavour Strait. Christian was charged with leading a shore party to collect water and was given muskets to ward off any inquisitive or aggressive islanders. Despite Bligh knowing the indigenous Tongans were unpredictable, he forbade Christian from taking the muskets on the recce to find water, instead ordering them to be left in the boat. The shore party was continually harassed once they made their way inland, and eventually retreated without the desired water, which entailed Bligh calling Christian a damned cowardly rascal. A small anchor and a woodworking tool were also stolen, which resulted in a further berating of Christian and Fryer. A few days later, Bligh accused Christian of stealing coconuts from the vessel's supply. As punishment for this, Bligh made the whole crew suffer, stopping their rum ration and halving their food consumption. Later, Bligh then asked Christian to join him for dinner in the officers' quarters, as if the reprimand had never even occurred. It was a common occurrence for the higher-ranking officers of a Royal Navy vessel to eat together, but this invite continued Bligh's leadership of belittlement, then ingratiation. This almost schizophrenic act of paranoia and cruelty was the final straw for Christian. He now planned to build a makeshift raft and float to the nearest island, choosing to rather be killed by natives than endure another minute under Bligh's control. He acquired some wood from the vessel's carpenter Purcell, and in doing so alerted most of the crew of his intentions. 2 of the young gentlemen came to him, with Stewart saying the men were ripe for anything, and Young telling him that the crew would be on his side if he were to depose Bligh. Christian mulled over his quandary deep into the night, and as the first inkling of daylight began creeping from the horizon, his mind was set. He was to end Bligh's cruel dictatorship, and himself become commander of the Bounty.